Have you ever had that feeling, where you're wrestling with some really deep philosophical idea? Like you're just scratching the surface.
Oh, absolutely.
What if we could, like, extract the core insights from even the most dense philosophical works, kind of tailor-made for folks like you and me who love to dive into these topics?
A philosophical deep dive,
Yeah.
so to speak. I like it.
Well, that's precisely what we're attempting to do here. This isn't just a summary or like a basic overview.
Right.
We're aiming for something more focused, a real excavation of the most crucial knowledge. And today, we're diving into the work of a true philosophical heavyweight.
A giant, even. And someone who I think any serious student of philosophy just has to grapple with.
Exactly. We're talking about the one and only David Lewis. And for this deep dive, our primary source is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on him.
It's incredibly thorough, really covers all the bases of his thought.
Yeah, and I think for our listeners, especially those with a philosophical bent, this is going to be really fascinating. Because Lewis, well, he just had this incredible impact across so many different areas of philosophy.
He really did. I mean, it's almost easier to list the areas he didn't touch.
Right. So think about this. Philosophy of language, mathematics, logic, science, decision theory, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, philosophy of mind, and metaphysics. And that's not even an exhaustive list.
Not even close. And the entry really highlights two areas where his contributions were, well, I'll say monumental.
Okay, so let's hear it. What are the big two?
First, his work in the philosophy of mind. He was a staunch materialist and developed this really sophisticated view that became known as analytic functionalism.
Right, analytic functionalism. And the second big area?
Metaphysics.
Yeah.
And specifically his articulation of two really key ideas, human supervenience and modal realism.
And these two areas alone, I mean, they really make him essential reading.
Absolutely. They're not just interesting or thought-provoking, but really foundational for understanding contemporary philosophy.
All right, so for our listeners out there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts, here's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try to get to the heart of Lewis's philosophical project. We'll start with kind of like the intellectual context where his ideas took shape.
Right, the foundations.
Then we'll dig into some of his key contributions. We'll talk about convention, counterfactuals, his philosophy of mind, Humean supervenience, and of course, his most famous and perhaps controversial idea, modal realism.
Sounds like a plan.
Are you ready to embark on this intellectual journey?
I am absolutely ready. Let's get started.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's think about Lewis's intellectual journey.
Sure. So academically, he started at Swarthmore, then went to Oxford. There, he encountered some pretty influential thinkers, people like J.L. Austin, Iris Murdoch, big names.
Wow, yeah.
Then he went on to Harvard for his Ph.D., studied under Quine.
That's quite a lineage.
It is. After that, he spent some time at UCLA and eventually landed at Princeton. That's where he stayed until he passed away in 2001.
Became a real fixture there.
Yeah, he did. And it's worth mentioning that he had really deep ties to the philosophical community in Australia. He visited a lot, received a bunch of honorary degrees, that kind of thing.
So it sounds like these early encounters, they really shaped his path, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, even philosophers who ended up disagreeing with him, with his overall philosophical system,
Yeah.
they still found his analyses of specific philosophical problems to be, like, incredibly valuable.
What was it about his approach that made it so engaging, even for those who didn't agree with him?
I think the key was this. He was very meticulous about separating the parts of his arguments that depended on his big picture theories
Okay.
from the parts that could stand on their own independently.
I see.
So even if you didn't buy into, say, modal realism, you could still learn a lot from how he analyzed counterfactuals, for instance.
That's pretty generous, intellectually speaking.
It is. It's part of what makes him so influential, even today.
And speaking of influential, let's talk about his first book, Convention. It came out in 1969, right?
Yeah, it was actually based on his dissertation at Harvard.
And in that book, he tackled a really fundamental question, like how do language and social practices even arise? How do we as a society come to these shared understandings?
Right. And his argument was, I think, pretty groundbreaking at the time. He said that conventions don't necessarily require, like, explicit agreements.
Oh, interesting. So we don't all sit down and sign a contract, so to speak.
Exactly. Instead, he proposed that conventions emerge. They're like regularities in behavior that arise as solutions to coordination problems.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Sure. Think about something as basic as which side of the road we drive on.
Okay, right.
We don't have, like, this big international treaty dictating it, but it's a stable convention because it's in everyone's best interest to just follow the established pattern.
Right, if everyone's driving on the right, it makes sense for me to do the same.
Exactly. It solves this problem of, like, potential chaos and accidents.
So how did Lewis explain this emergence of conventions?
He very cleverly used game theory, actually, especially the work of Thomas Schelling on cooperative games.
Okay.
He showed how these self-sustaining regularities, these conventions, can arise without us needing to explicitly communicate or have some central authority telling us what to do.
And he didn't just stick to these kind of idealized game theory scenarios, right?
No, he extended the framework to try and capture the messiness of real-world interactions, where individual interests might only partially align.
It sounds like a really subtle analysis. So how did he actually define convention, like formally?
He gave a definition that's, I think, intentionally somewhat flexible,
Okay, why flexible?
because he wanted to capture the intuitive nature of the concept.
That makes sense.
But the core idea is this. A regularity R within a population P in a situation S counts as a convention if almost everyone in P conforms to R and S, almost everyone believes that there's this conformity, and this belief gives them a reason to conform themselves.
And there's this idea of common knowledge that he uses,
Yeah.
right?
And that's really crucial. It's not just that I know that you know that I know.
Right, an infinite chain of knowledge.
Exactly. It's more like everyone has sufficient reason to believe something and a sufficient reason to believe that everyone else has that same reason and so on. And the thing is,
Yeah.
the truth of those beliefs isn't strictly necessary for the convention to hold.
Oh, that's interesting. So even if we're all wrong about something, the convention can still function.
Right. Which is subtle, but important, I think.
So how did he apply all this to language?
That was the really brilliant part. He argued, particularly in the last chapter of Convention, that language itself can be understood as being grounded in these kinds of conventions.
Okay, how so?
So he defined languages by their truth conditions. And he formulated these truth conditions in terms of possible worlds, a concept we'll come back to later.
All right.
But the basic idea is a community speaks a particular language. L, if and only if there's a persistent convention within that community of acting in a way that makes truths in L likely and falsehoods in L unlikely.
I could see how that might sound a little strange to a philosopher. Isn't truth, like, inherent to the very idea of language?
Right, that's the initial reaction I had too.
So what's Lewis getting at here?
His point is that there are always other possible languages we could be using. The fact that we consistently and coordinately use this specific language with its particular truth conditions is what makes it the convention in our community.
I see.
Of course, he refined this theory later on, especially in his essay, Languages and Language.
What kinds of refinements did he make?
Well, he addressed some challenges that had been raised, like Hawthorne's point about the problems with really long sentences, and he introduced the idea of natural properties to give a better account of meaning.
Okay, but the core idea of language as a convention of truthfulness,
That remains central to his thinking.
that's fascinating. And I think it naturally leads us to his next major work, Counterfactuals. Not only was it a huge contribution to the philosophy of language and logic, but it laid the groundwork for a lot of his broader metaphysical ideas.
Absolutely. Counterfactuals, like statements about what could have been, became essential tools for him. He used them in his accounts of laws of nature, causation.
Right, causation.
And perhaps most importantly, they provided a major motivation for his commitment to the reality of possible worlds.
So let's talk about that. Counterfactuals. How did Lewis approach them?
Okay, so the dominant view in philosophy back then in the mid-20th century was to treat counterfactuals as a kind of strict implication.
Okay.
So basically to say if P were the case, then Q would be the case, is true if it's logically necessary that either P is false or Q is true.
Right.
But Lewis argued against this.
He challenged the status quo.
He did. He pointed out that adding more conditions to the beginning part of a counterfactual, antecedent, can change whether it's true or false.
I see.
And that's just not how strict implication works.
Right, right. Do you have an example of that?
Sure, there's this classic example about Smith. Imagine Smith running for mayor. The counterfactual, if Smith had won the election, he would have become mayor. Might be true,
Makes sense.
but now, add this, and if he had been disqualified.
Okay.
So the whole thing now is, if Smith had won the election and been disqualified, he would have become mayor.
Now that one might not be true.
Exactly. He might be too busy doing something else, like, I don't know, leading a protest or something.
So this sensitivity to added conditions.
Shows that the strict conditional analysis is not quite right.
I see. So what did Lewis propose instead?
Well, building on the work of Stalnaker, he proposed an analysis based on possible worlds. And crucially, how similar these possible worlds are to the actual world.
Okay, break that down for me.
The basic idea is this. A counterfactual like P would have led to Q is true if and only if, in all the closest possible worlds where P is true, Q is also true.
So we have to look at these other worlds, these possible worlds.
Exactly. And see what happens in the ones that are most like our own world, but where that first part, the P part, is true.
And did he just take Stalnaker's idea wholesale?
Not quite. He refined it in a couple of important ways.
Yeah.
First, he rejected the idea that there's always a single, most similar world.
I see. So there could be multiple equally similar worlds.
Right. And second, he defended this seemingly obvious but philosophically tricky idea that the actual world is more similar to itself than to any other possible world.
Which I guess makes sense, but it's not something we usually think about explicitly.
Right.
Okay, so possible worlds, similarity. This is all getting pretty abstract.
It is. And this leads to a really crucial question. What does similarity between possible worlds even mean?
Yeah, how do we measure that?
Lewis himself recognized that this was a big issue. It's not some primitive notion we can just take for granted.
Right.
So, in response to some pretty influential criticisms, like there's this famous example from Kit Fine involving Nixon and a button.
Okay.
Lewis, in his paper Counterfactual Dependence and Time's Arrow, gave a detailed algorithm for determining similarity, at least in standard cases.
And an algorithm, like a step-by-step procedure.
Yeah, exactly. And it involves this ranked list of criteria.
Okay, so what's most important?
The most important thing is to avoid significant, widespread violations of the laws of nature as they operate in our world.
So the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, all that, they should stay pretty much the same.
Right. The second most important thing is maximizing the spatio-temporal region, a perfect match between the counterfactual world and the actual world.
So the bigger the region where the two worlds are identical, the more similar they are.
Exactly. Then third comes avoiding even minor, localized violations of laws.
And what about specific facts, like whether I had cereal or toast for breakfast this morning? Does that matter for similarity?
Surprisingly, those kinds of specific facts have very little weight in Lewis's algorithm.
Interesting. So a world where the laws of physics are slightly different is considered more similar to ours than a world where my breakfast choice was different, even if everything else is the same.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing the extent and severity of those law violations.
It's a really fascinating way to think about counterfactuals.
It is. And it helps us understand why, a world where some complex physical mechanism spontaneously breaks down, leading to a different outcome,
Yeah.
might be considered less similar to our world than a world where a specific event unfolds differently because of, like, a very localized deviation from the actual course of events.
Because the first one involves more law violations. It's like a bigger disruption to the fabric of reality.
Precisely.
And this idea of similarity, it also helps us make sense of counterfactuals about very specific events.
Right. It suggests that the most similar worlds are those where there's just a tiny divergence from what actually happened, a minimal change. But the fundamental laws still operate more or less as they do here.
I see. So Lewis's analysis, it wasn't without its critics, right?
Oh, of course not. I mean, Jonathan Bennett, for example, raised some important objections about counterfactuals whose antecedents aren't about specific events.
Okay.
But even with those criticisms, Lewis's possible worlds analysis of counterfactuals was incredibly influential. It gave philosophers this really powerful tool for tackling all sorts of problems, from causation to the meaning of everyday language.
So let's shift gears a bit now. Let's talk about Lewis's contributions to the philosophy of mind.
A vast and complex area.
It is, and he had two main focuses, right? His reductionist metaphysics, where he defended this idea that the mind and brain are really the same thing, and his theory of mental content.
Exactly. Two sides of the same coin, in a way.
And both rooted in his materialist worldview. So let's start with the reductionist side. Where did he begin?
Well, his 1966 paper, An Argument for the Identity Theory, was a really important early contribution.
Okay. And how did his argument go?
Unlike a lot of arguments for physicalism at the time, which focused on simplicity or parsimony,
Okay.
Lewis focused on the fact that our subjective experiences, things like feeling pain, seem to have real causal effects in the world.
So my feeling of pain causes me to, I don't know, pull my hand away from a hot stove.
Right, exactly. And his argument went like this. Mental states, like pains, are functionally defined by their typical physical causes and their behavioral effects. This is how we understand them in our everyday, common sense folk psychology.
So the first premise is about how we ordinarily think about things like pain.
Right. Now, the second premise is this principle of the causal closure of the physical realm.
Causal closure, meaning...
It means that every physical effect has a complete physical cause.
Okay, so there are no gaps in the physical causal chain.
Right. So Lewis's argument is, if these mental states are playing these causal roles, and every physical effect has a physical cause, then whatever is actually instantiating these mental states, whatever is realizing them.
Must itself be physical.
Exactly. So the conclusion is that mental states are identical to certain physical states.
I see. So it's a contingent identity. It's not that mental states are necessarily identical to physical states, just that they happen to be in our world, given how things are causally structured.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He later refined this view, saying that a specific kind of mental state, like pain in humans, is identical to whatever specific brain state typically plays that pain role in humans.
So pain in humans is a particular kind of neural activity.
Right.
But this straightforward identity theory, it ran into some problems, right?
It did. There's the famous problem of multiple realizability.
Which is?
The idea that the same type of mental state could be realized by different physical states in different creatures.
Okay, so like maybe pain in humans is realized by one neural state?
But pain in an octopus, with its very different nervous system, might be realized by a completely different physical state.
Right, or what about hypothetical Martians with silicon brains?
Exactly. And there's also the problem of, like, madmen who might experience pain, but not exhibit the typical aversive behavior.
So how did Lewis deal with these multiple realizability worries?
He argued that terms like pain should be understood as being relative to kinds of creatures. So pain in humans is whatever physical state plays the pain role in humans.
Okay.
Pain in Martians is whatever physical state, silicon-based or whatever, plays the pain role in Martians.
So it's kind relative.
Right. This let him allow for both atypical responses within a species and for the same mental state to be realized differently in different kinds of beings.
It's a subtle but important move. He's holding on to the core idea of materialism.
But acknowledging that the mapping between mental states and physical states might be more complex than initially thought.
Okay, so that's the reductionist side of his philosophy of mind. What about his theory of mental content? Like what our thoughts are about?
Right, mental content. So here he followed Davidson in adopting an interpretationist approach. The idea is that the content of a mental state is what best makes sense of the agent's behavior, especially in terms of rationalizing their actions.
So we figure out what someone believes by looking at how they act, what they do.
Exactly. But Lewis diverged from Davidson in some important ways.
How so?
Well, for one, he didn't think that verbal behavior, language, was the only key to interpreting mental content.
Okay.
And he also strongly defended this idea of narrow content, meaning the content of our thoughts doesn't necessarily depend on the specific details of the external world.
So my thought that water is wet could have the same content even if, I don't know, I was living in a possible world where water wasn't wet.
Exactly. And finally, he was anti-individualistic.
Meaning?
He emphasized the typical role of a mental state within a kind of creature, rather than just focusing on an individual's unique history and context.
So what matters is the species typical function of a belief, not just my idiosyncratic way of using it.
Right.
And there's one really innovative aspect of Lewis's theory of mental content, right?
Yes. His revised understanding of the objects of belief and desire.
So what did he think we believe and desire?
Traditionally, philosophers thought we believe and desire propositions, like sets of possible worlds that make a statement true.
Okay.
But Lewis argued, especially in his paper Attitude to Dicto and to Say, that beliefs and desires are fundamentally self-ascriptions of properties.
Properties, so like being read, being a philosopher.
Exactly. So instead of propositions, we have sets of possible individuals that have a certain property.
And this helped him solve some problems.
Yeah, big problems. Problems about self-locating beliefs, like in the famous amnesiac case.
Refresh my memory on that one.
Sure. Imagine you're an amnesiac. You see yourself in the mirror, but you don't remember who you are. You happen to believe that the person in the mirror is a notorious art thief, but you also believe that you are definitely not an art thief.
So there's a potential contradiction there.
Right. But Lewis's self-ascription account solves it beautifully.
How?
When you believe that the person in the mirror is an art thief, you're ascribing the property of being an art thief to whoever you take yourself to be in that moment, the person in the mirror.
Okay.
And when you believe that you are not an art thief, you're ascribing the property of not being an art thief to yourself.
I see. So there are two different self-ascriptions going on.
Exactly. And they can both be true even if, unbeknownst to you, you actually are that art thief in the mirror.
So this self-ascriptive view.
It captures the egocentric nature of a lot of our beliefs and desires.
Really elegant solution.
It is.
Now, one ongoing challenge for these interpretationist theories of content is the possibility that an agent's behavior might underdetermine their beliefs.
Right. The classic Green problem and related skeptical scenarios highlight this.
So how did Lewis respond to that?
By increasingly emphasizing this idea of natural properties.
Natural properties.
Okay. He argued that some properties are just more fundamental than others. They carve reality at its joints, so to speak. They pick out genuine similarities between things.
And these natural properties, they play a key role in all sorts of places in his philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. Rationality, mental content, linguistic meaning, the laws of nature. Natural properties are everywhere.
So how do they help with the underdetermination problem?
Well, if there are multiple interpretations of an agent's beliefs that all fit their behavior equally well, Lewis says we should go with the interpretation that uses more natural properties.
The more natural, the better.
Right. Same goes for interpretations of language.
It's like these natural properties provide an anchor for understanding. They ground things in something more objective, less dependent on just like our subjective interpretation.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So this idea of natural properties, it was really central for Lewis. And it leads us to his big, ambitious project, the one we mentioned earlier.
You mean Humean supervenience?
That's the one.
It's a radical claim. The claim that everything that exists, all the truths about reality, are nothing more than the arrangement of perfectly local intrinsic properties across space-time.
Like a giant mosaic, but made of fundamental physical qualities.
Exactly. Lewis called this the Humean mosaic.
And everything else, everything we talk about.
Laws of nature, chances, causation, dispositions, even things like colors.
All of that has to ultimately be grounded in this mosaic.
It has to supervene on it, meaning there can't be any difference in those things without a difference in the arrangement of the fundamental properties.
It's a really bold reductionist program, trying to show that all these seemingly complex and irreducible aspects of reality are ultimately just patterns in the fundamental stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Lewis, he spent a lot of time trying to spell out in detail how concepts like laws, chances, and causation could be understood within this Humean framework.
So let's talk about those. Laws of nature, for example. How did he account for those?
He was a big fan of the best systems account.
Okay, tell me more about that.
The idea is that the laws of nature are the generalizations that show up as axioms or theorems in the best deductive system that perfectly describes the Humean mosaic.
So the laws are the most concise and informative summary of how things are arranged in the mosaic.
Right. And best here means striking the right balance between simplicity and strength, like how much information the system can pack in.
And this view of laws, it wasn't static for Lewis, was it?
Oh, no, he kept refining it, especially when he was working out the implications for chance and this really important principle called the principal principle.
The principle, what is that one about?
It's about how rational agents should align their beliefs about future events with known chances.
So if I know there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, my degree of belief that it will rain should be 0.5.
Exactly. But there's some tricky philosophical issues there. And Lewis's later formulation, which is often called the new principle, was his attempt to reconcile the best systems account with our intuitive understanding of probability.
Okay, so that's laws. What about causation?
In his earlier work, he had a really influential analysis in terms of counterfactual dependence. Basically, one event causes another if the second event wouldn't have happened without the first, and if there's a chain of such dependencies linking the two.
So if I strike a match and it lights, the striking caused the lighting because the lighting wouldn't have happened without the striking.
Right. But he later revised this view, proposing the causation as influence theory.
Influence.
Yeah, the focus here is on how much one event influences another. And you measure that by looking at systematic patterns of counterfactual dependence across different ways the first event might have occurred.
So how much does changing the first event change the probability of the second event.
Exactly.
Now, given all this, a philosopher might ask, why was Lewis so committed to this Humean supervenience project?
Yeah, it can seem really restrictive, especially considering what we know from modern physics.
Right, like Bell's theorem, quantum entanglement, all that.
It suggests there might be these fundamental, non-local correlations in the universe, stuff that doesn't fit neatly into the Humean mosaic.
So what was Lewis's response to these challenges?
He was often quite pragmatic. He didn't necessarily insist that Humean supervenience is definitely true of our world, the way physics ultimately describes it.
So he wasn't being dogmatic about it.
No. His goal was more to show that it's possible, that it's a tenable framework.
I see.
He wanted to refute the philosophical arguments that claim supervenience is impossible by showing how all these things like laws, intentions, values
Yeah.
could, at least in principle, arise from a Humean base.
So a kind of compatibilism in the realm of metaphysics. He was trying to show that a scientific worldview, even a simplified one, could accommodate all these rich aspects of our experience.
Exactly. And Humean supervenience was the recipe, or at least a sketch of a recipe for how to do that.
Okay, so that brings us to, arguably, Lewis's most famous and controversial idea. The one that really made a splash in the philosophical world.
Modal realism.
That's the one. The idea that there are countless other worlds, just as real as our own, but causally isolated from us.
And that these other worlds, these possible worlds, are what make modal claims true.
So when we say something like, it's possible that I could have been a musician instead of a philosopher.
We're literally talking about another world, just as concrete as this one, where a counterpart of you exists and is a musician.
It's a mind-blowing idea and one that a lot of philosophers found hard to swallow.
Right.
So how did Lewis defend it?
He had a couple of main arguments. The first one, presented in Counterfactuals, was called the argument by paraphrase.
Okay.
And it was surprisingly straightforward given how radical the claim is. He basically said, look, when we say things could have been different, we're talking about how things could have been. And those ways things could have been are what he calls possible worlds.
So the very way we talk about possibility commits us to the existence of these other worlds.
That's the idea. But he later gave a more developed argument on the plurality of worlds, his big book on the topic. This one's called the indispensability argument.
And what's that one about?
It says that accepting possible worlds makes our philosophical theories way more powerful and explanatory across a bunch of different areas like modal language, counterfactuals, properties, propositions, even the nature of individuals.
So possible worlds are indispensable tools for doing philosophy.
Exactly. And he insisted that these possible worlds are just as real as our own. They're concrete, they exist, they're just causally and spatiotemporally isolated from us and from each other.
So no traveling to these other worlds, unfortunately.
Afraid not. And he also had this principle of recombination, which said that almost any combination of properties, as long as it's logically consistent, can be instantiated in some possible world.
So there's a world out there where pigs can fly, and another one where I'm a world-famous concert pianist.
Exactly. As long as those things aren't logically contradictory, there's a world for it.
Of course, a lot of philosophers push back against this.
Oh yeah, there were tons of objections. People thought it was extravagant, that there was no empirical evidence for all these other universes. They're worried about paradoxes, about what it means for our world to be just one among many.
And what did Lewis say to all these objections?
He engaged with them really carefully. Sometimes he'd tweak the principle of recombination to avoid paradoxes, or he'd argue that the problems people raised weren't unique to modal realism.
So other metaphysical views had the same problems, they just weren't as upfront about it.
Exactly.
Okay, so possible worlds, but what about us? What about individuals? Do we exist in these other worlds?
That's where counterpart theory comes in.
Right, counterpart theory.
It's how Lewis explains what it means for a person to could have been different.